Hello, and thank you for joining today's discussion on how companies are building climate resilience. I'm Amy Bailey. I'm the Director for Climate Resilience and Sustainability here at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. Before we dive into today's lineup, I want to share a few housekeeping items for the webinar. Now, the format of today's event will be opening presentation, followed by an expert panel and a moderated discussion, and we'll close the webinar with audience Q&A. A little bit more detail there. The first presentation by Amy Barnes of Marsh will bring us the latest on the state of corporate planning and action for climate resilience and adaptation. And then we'll be joined by a panel of experts to share their perspectives from 3 companies that are driving climate resilience action today. Now, the time for audience Q&A will be at the end of the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. You can submit your questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom platform, so it should be an option there at the bottom of your screen. We've also enabled closed captioning, and if you'd like to access that feature, you can click the button at the bottom of the screen as well. We will be recording today's conversation, and that will be made available on C2ES's YouTube page within the next 24 hours, and we'll email out a recording for folks afterwards. If you have any technical questions during the webinar, you can please email webinar@c2es.org. Now, in a few minutes, we'll have a chance to hear from our experts, but first, I'd like to say a few words about our work at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. If you're not familiar with us, welcome and thank you for joining us. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. For more than 20 years, we've been working with policymakers, businesses, and other stakeholders to build support for effective and ambitious climate policies and practices. Core to our work is the conviction that smart, well-designed policies and business action can grow the economy, sustain good jobs, improve people's daily lives, and increase the climate resilience of communities, especially marginalized communities. Now, a critical piece of the climate resilience conversation, our ability to withstand a changing climate, especially, is the private sector's ability to be resilient and alongside it as it's undergoing transformational decarbonization. But also a part of this is the private sector's ability to enable resilience in the broader community. So, as we focus today's conversation on private sector innovation, I want to highlight just a few things. Many of you have probably seen the most recent UN report concluding that we're on track for up to 3 degrees Celsius of warming. This joins a string of other findings over the last years with similar dire warnings. And this obviously will be a big game changer for the planet. And of course, as many of you also know, COP29 will begin in less than 2 weeks to once again push countries to take ambitious action to limit warming and prepare for the impacts of climate change. Of course, we know leadership is needed from every type of actor, including those in the private sector. And so that's why we are, hosting this conversation today. So the question to kind of set the stage for us is, what does corporate action look like, particularly on the resilience question? Philip, if you could put the slide on here. In March, we released the Principles for Corporate Climate Resilience Leadership to basically set a guiding compass for companies to advance their climate resilience approaches. And we'll share the link in the chat. In short, these principles, which were created in consultation with dozens of corporate climate experts, set out that companies leading on climate resilience are science-based and proactive, they're transparent and accountable, they're safeguarding and enhancing, inclusive and equitable, and transformative. Now, these are aspirational. This is the high bar of what we expect companies that are leading in this space should be striving for. And of course, we're all starting in many different different starting points, and so this is hopefully a useful tool. Now, the question then becomes, what does this look like in practice? Next slide. Tomorrow, we'll publish a new report called From Principles to Action: How Companies Are Building Climate Resilience. And that report will spotlight how businesses are taking real-world action to build climate resilience. Our aim is to showcase the variety of ways that companies can demonstrate leadership and encourage resilience practices that benefit both the business and society as well. Included in the report will be 8 innovation stories of companies assessing, preparing for, and adapting to physical climate impacts. You can also find these stories online in our Innovation Story Library, where we will continue to add examples in the future. An important note about these stories is that each example is aligning with at least one of the principles for corporate climate resilience leadership. And I'll just note, this is all part of a broader set of work under C2ES's Corporate Climate Resilience Pathways initiative. So while we're happy to share these resources, it's clear that with every extreme weather event, we're reminded that there's a lot of work to do. And that brings us to today's conversation. Business as usual is no longer going to be working in a climate changed world. And so our goal here is to shed some light on the ways that companies are pioneering innovative strategies to build their own resilience in the communities they serve. Maybe today you'll hear something that sparks an idea for you in your own organization. And with that, I will introduce our first keynote speaker, Amy Barnes, who's the head of climate and sustainability strategy at Marsh. Amy is going to share findings from the company's new corporate survey, the State of Corporate Planning and Action. And so, Amy, I will turn it to you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So if you wouldn't mind putting slides up, please, Philip, if I could start by just talking about how we think about resilience, the framework that we use for adaptation and resilience. Not surprisingly, we start thinking at the asset level. And I think what we'll see in the survey that most people start thinking about their physical assets. And really, when they think about climate change, many people are thinking about the potential for weather events to cause damage to their assets. However, at that asset level or at the individual site level, there's a lot more going on. And we need to think about how operations need to change. How do inspection and maintenance operations need to change? What work will your people need to do? Will they be available to work? And that isn't just there's been a flood, they can't drive to the facility. It could well be that as a result of wildfire, we have more respiratory illnesses, people have children with asthma, they're not able to work in the same way. And then finally, I think something that's often forgotten at the site level is the emergency response. So whether it's a climate event or not, we need to make sure that we've got the resources available to respond to an emergency. And many industrial sites rely on their own fire water ponds to combat a fire. And we saw that in the tragic Maui fires last year, fire water often wasn't available when it was needed. And so how do we make sure that if the worst happens, whether it's a climate cause or not, we're still able to respond? But beyond that, we need to think about the wider system in which those assets operate. And some of those assets are critical to the operations of the site as well. So I don't know if everybody's familiar with the term ecosystem resources, but that's what we rely on nature and the natural environment and the climate to provide us. And many businesses rely on ecosystem services. So an example of an ecosystem service would be the pollinators that pollinate the almond trees in California to make sure we can all drink almond milk. But it's also the sun shining for a solar farm or the wind blowing for a wind turbine. But I think we often forget as an ecosystem service how important water is, because many, most, maybe even all manufacturing processes require some element of water. And one of the most alarming statistics I find, or data points, is that in Taiwan, the government have been paying rice farmers not to grow rice to ensure there's enough water available to serve the semiconductor industry. And so understanding those dependencies on ecosystem services and how they could change with climate change. We also need to think about critical infrastructure. So I think much publicized has been the impact or the lack of availability of rivers as a critical waterway, We know the Amazon is in drought, the Mississippi is in drought still, a lot of the European rivers were in drought last year, which makes it hard to get goods and services up and down the river. But we also have dependencies on critical infrastructure. After a hurricane or flood event, do you still have access to power and clean water? And then also your supply chain. Your operations depend on the supply chain, and there can be climate disruptions throughout that ecosystem that could disrupt you. We need to think about how our customers are going to be affected, not just in their buying preferences, but their ability to consume the good or service that's being produced. How is regulation going to change you? What's your role within the community that you operate, and how can you support them? And really importantly, how are capital providers, and when I say that, I mean banks, insurers, how are they thinking about your resilience and what it means for the products and services that they deliver? So sorry for that fairly long sort of overview, but if we can move on to the next slide, I'll start to share the survey findings. Now, in the chat, we'll post a link where you can get far more detail on the findings, this information, plus much more. But some of the key findings, the first thing I'm going to say is that I think we had selection bias in the people that responded to the survey. I think to some extent, it presents a slightly rosy picture for the amount of work that companies are doing, because I think it's the companies that were most affected, or maybe some of the most progressive companies that have responded. And so I expect when we do the survey again next year, I really wouldn't be surprised if the numbers get worse. But I think we should start by focusing on the very first number, that 50% of our respondents suffered an extreme weather event in the past 3 years, and 45 of those suffered a financial loss. Amy Bailey introduced me as being part of the risk and insurance industry, and I promise you, insurers are not anticipating that 45% of their clients will have a weather-related loss in any one year, because it's supposed to be the losses of the few that are paid for by the many. 45 is never the few. So I think that's something that we really need to be aware of, the frequency with which events are happening. Now, coming to the selection bias, we see that 83% of organisations say that they are assessing their future climate risks to their organisation. And when I validate that with many companies in the real economy, so in the real economy, the people that are selling things rather than the financial services industry, they feel that's quite a flattering number, and that really not so many organisations are going deep on that. But I do believe that 72% are considering climate adaptation and resilience in their regular risk management process, because whether we're thinking about future climate and how the climate will change and risks will accelerate, or whether we're thinking about our current exposure as of today, I think it is far more common practice that organisations are embedding that in risk management. I spent a couple of moments on the earlier slide talking about the issues beyond the asset level. And we see that 30% of our participants are thinking beyond that immediate asset level, which I think is actually really good, because own asset is where we start. So 30% level of maturity where they're thinking beyond that. And many of our companies are thinking about their business continuity. So we're not always, when we think about resilience, we think about resilience in two ways. We think about our ability to resist the impact of climate change, and also our ability to recover, because there may be some assets that it's not possible to remove the risk of being flooded to zero, but if we are flooded, we need to be able to recover as quickly as possible. But if we flick to the next slide, please, Philip. This is the framework again, shown alongside our survey results. And so you won't be surprised to see that at the asset level, physical assets is where it's had the majority of attention, with people then focusing their time on their operations and their people. And people, certainly when people speak from insurance perspective, we can forget about the human element, but it's critical that we're thinking about people and how we support them, not just so they're available to do their work, but so that they are as part of our responsibility within society. But when we get to systems level, you'll see there's been far less of a focus. So I'm going to start with the light yellow, the capital providers, the banks and insurers. And I promise you that capital providers are thinking about adaptation and resilience. Many of the large banks have already assessed their loan portfolios, their mortgage books, to understand how much of their debt is susceptible to climate change. So could they have more credit risk in that loan portfolio in the future due to climate change? Insurers similarly are thinking about those issues. Government and regulation is always hard to anticipate, so slightly less surprised there's been more focus. but ecosystem resources worries me that it isn't a higher priority. In agriculture, people are thinking about that. If you don't have access to water to irrigate, there's a really direct impact, but some of those more cascading impacts aren't being considered. And then finally, you see in the middle that we're seeing the maturing as people are looking at their operations around suppliers and critical infrastructure, but also focusing on the people element of communities. I know you want to hear from the case study, so I will speak to the last slide very, very quickly. This is not an eyesight test. As I say, all of the data is on the website, but you can see in dark blue the measures that companies are already implementing. Light blue, they're budgeted for and they're coming forward in the cycle soon. And then green, those measures aren't considered relevant at the moment. Now, what's critical is that the dark blue, those areas where we've already seen investments, for most of those investments, most of those companies are saying, and we need to do more, but these investments are just the start of the journey. So let me pause there, Amy Bailey, and hand back to you to hear some of the case studies.
Thank you, Amy. And I just really appreciate how your study has drawn out some of the complexity of what this conversation is and all of the, the different interdependencies that, any one organization has on, the external environment and on, other companies in the value chain, on the communities that they're serving or that they exist in. I think it's really helpful to kind of have that pulse check of where companies are right now and kind of where the ball is moving forward or where there might be more opportunity to push things ahead. So we will bring you back for the discussion and looking forward to that. I'd like to introduce our three wonderful panelists. If you could just pop on the screen here to say hello for a quick moment, and then I'll tee you up individually. So we have today with us Tawichat Wangbupanamit. Hopefully I got that right, Tawi, the social impact manager on the corporate affairs and impact team at AES Corporation. We also have Francis Renaud, the group risk manager at Michelin. Thanks for joining us, Francis. And we also have Monica Serrano, the Resilience Program Manager at Turner Construction. So a really great panel ahead. Each panelist will have about 6 minutes or so for some opening remarks. I'd like to ask that you each introduce your company and your company's approach to climate risks, and then have the floor to highlight a specific effort that you're undergoing to build resilience, either in the business, in the value chain, or in the surrounding community. And as a reminder to all of our participants, as you hear these remarks today, you can submit your questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom platform, and we'll see what we can get to near the end. So we will go ahead and start with you, Tawi. Thanks so much for being with us. Francis and Monica, you can go off screen for a few minutes and then we'll pull you back in. Tawi, super exciting to see some of the work that you're doing there at AES. Look forward to hearing what you'd like to share today.
Thanks, Amy. There we go. So, good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is Tawi, and I am with AES, calling from our Arlington, Virginia headquarters. So, for those who aren't familiar with AES, we are a global energy company, and we are made up of over 9,600 people just working across 13 different countries. And our operations generate enough electricity to power about over 22 million people around the world. And at AES, we like to just say that a lot of our work is driven by our purpose, which is really accelerating the future of energy together. And the story that I'm going to share today, Menguera del Golfo, which is a region in El Salvador, is really about the partnership, the innovation, and then the access to really ensure that we are responsibly transitioning energy systems in markets where we're operating in a responsible way, and also embedding climate resilience into the process, and also ensuring that the benefits of these projects flows to the communities and also the local environment that that the project is based in. Philip, we can go to the next two slides actually. Yep, perfect. Thank you. So just a little bit about um, Manguera del Golfo. It really starts with AES's strategy around lowering greenhouse gas emission and creating a carbon free energy future. And this is across all the communities where we operate. And when we talk about reducing emissions, it's really more than just the power generation side of our business. We're talking about understanding what are the unique needs of the country, the customers that we are working with, and then most importantly, the communities where these projects are being based. And so when we take all of that into account, we think about sustainability, reliability, and affordability. So if we talk about those three things, we're just trying to find that right balance. And so when it came to Manguera del Golfo, we were dealing with a situation where about 15 years ago, we actually helped energize the island by connecting a submarine cable, connecting the island. So it's a cluster of island communities with mainland El Salvador. And so what we were running into and what the communities were running into was that line would occasionally get damaged, whether it's because of shipping, um, we like ships coming through the regions and causing damage to the cable or just wear and tear. And to just repair that single cable that was energizing these communities, it could take anywhere from 5 to 15 days. So, with our various partners, and this included partners at the, the the national level. So we're talking about the national government down to the local government. We really wanted to address this issue, and so we we s- we really took our global expertise developing distributed energy projects to see like how can we bring that to a smaller scale while still meeting the needs of this community. So in 2023, um, we developed this solar plus storage solution to really ensure that the community did not have to deal with that unreliable energy that they have been experiencing for the past 15 years, or well, the project itself was commissioned in 2023, so 15 years going into like the commissioning of this new solar plus storage. Philip, we can go to the next slide. So really want to talk about with this slide about like the benefits, and that was really the driver of us pursuing this project. It really was about the people and making sure that they had the conditions needed to really uh, ensure that their economy was thriving, that their basic needs were met, and as a result of having this project online, instead of dealing with the unreliable power, 800 families, along with local businesses and other key stakeholders, they were able, they're now able to have that reliable energy. And that has also translated, Philip, if you want to go to the next slide very quickly. It has translated to a lot of benefits for the communities where they now have the power to have 24/7 water supply, healthcare services as well. We were also able to address issues around digital divide and making sure that the community had internet access. So really this project served as that catalyst for this cluster of islands in a remote part of El Salvador to have the basic services that oftentimes a lot of us here in the global north would take for granted. And so if we can go to the next slide, just really wanted to wrap up here by sharing how it really wasn't about like the megawatts as much on paper. I should have started by saying that this was like a 1 megawatt power, which if we look at our entire portfolio, well, 1 megawatt in terms of solar, and then 4 megawatts on the battery storage side. And this was really about making sure that Minguera del Golfo, the region, had reliable energy and that the communities had the conditions that they needed to grow their economy. And that was a priority for AES and our various stakeholders involved in the project, from government to our customers, and then a lot of community leaders that were invested in this project. And happy to take questions. Amy, I'll pause there, and yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's just such a great example of, how reliable access to energy is such a critical piece of community resilience and capacity. So I think that, such a transformative kind of project for folks in those communities. Thank you, Tawi. I'd like to turn over to you, Francis, at Michelin next. We've been so intrigued to learn how Michelin has been assessing and quantifying its risks across the business. And so I'd love to give you the floor to share your approach and some of the insights that you've gathered along the way.
Thank you so much, Amy. Hello, everyone. So my name is Francis. So I'm now working for a Michelin company. I will explain what is Michelin, and I'm in charge of adaptation to physical climate risks since 1 year and a half. So you may imagine that's a quite new position within the group. So just to remind that Michelin is a worldwide company, which strongly believe that the future can only be sustainable, not only for us, but I would say also for all the communities. We have undisputed expertise in composites, an advanced manufacturing process. We are constantly innovating to design, of course, premium tires, but not only. We're also polymer-based, designing and producing and selling polymer-based components for critical application in different products, in special area, in pipelines area, in tire area, etc., etc. Also designing and providing the connected solution for fleets, and of course, let's say we have a remarkable experience in providing to our customer restaurant experience, and notably through the Michelin Guide. So we have different brands. I'm not talking about that today, but of course, there are well-known brands also in America and in North America. More or less, more than 130,000 people working within Michelin with the community, and a footprint only when it comes to production sites of more than 130 production sites, but thousands of sites, in fact, throughout the world, notably when it comes to warehouses, headquarters, tertiary activities, etc., etc. So let's focus on climate change and what we are doing on that. I'm not going to share a lot of slides. In fact, no slides. Just take the time to, I hope, exchange with you about what we are doing. There are two complementary actions within Michelin when it comes to climate change. One, which is historical, that is to say, transition, decreasing of our carbon footprint throughout the value chains. First, of course, through our product, because maybe you're aware, maybe not, but 90% of emissions, when we are considering the life cycle of our activity, of carbon dioxide emissions, are emitted through the use of the tire, because the tire is contributing to use fuel from your car or from your truck, and that represents a lot. In fact, roughly between 20% to 40%, depending on the type of vehicles we are talking about. So Scope 3 is very important, and use phase is very important. But of course, we are committed externally in a very visible way, I would say, to decrease, to arrive to a neutral position by 90, decrease the emission coming from our scope 1 and 2, that is to say, our production sites, and also having actions through the value chains, considering the transportation phases and also the upstream phase, that is to say, our suppliers. And that's historical, I would say. We are doing that since decades. When it comes to adaptation, there was a wake-up call, I would say, in 21 on this subject, and strong action starting in 2022 when it comes to adaptation, again, to a physical climate risk. So it has been then developed recently within the company with a specific position relating to that since 1 year and a half, not more, but we are trying to go fast on this subject. A first exposure analysis has been done on a few sites in 2021 and through the value chain, and definitely that was a wake-up call showing us that it was necessary to act on adaptation because of the pace at which the climate change is expressing its effects today and, of course, in the future. And those consequences, of course, you know them. And the first one for us is the critical one, people. We are talking about risk for employees, risk for their health, whatever it is, physical health or mental health, but of course, physical health, health and safety, whatever we are talking about acute or chronic risk relating to the climate change. And of course, discontinuity of operations, and also our own operations, but also supply disruption, or maybe also problem at customer sites, car maker, truck makers. So in order to, I would say, sustain what we need to do, we have published, it's available for you in our internet website, a dedicated adaptation policy dedicated to physical climate risk, which specify the climate management, risk management of the company, the implementation time frame, and the need to undertake this endeavor jointly with all the stakeholders, that is to say, all the value chains, considering our own sites, of course, our clients, again, car makers, truck makers, suppliers, any kind of partners, and of course, specific partners which are the communities where our plants are located. We cannot only adapt a site, we must consider the way the local community are adapting. So in order to do that, the first thing is to assess the exposure. So we are examining the entire value chain through the lens of the climate emergency in order to ascertain the exposure and assess the vulnerability in terms of health and safety of people, continuity of operation, and the markets also, because in the future, maybe there will be strong changes when it comes notably to the market of tires. This year, we have assessed more than 700 of our sites and more or less 250 sites of raw material supplier. That's for exposure, and next year we will probably assess the remaining part of the Michelin group and oversight of the value chains. We are talking about thousands of sites, and we will do that by the end of next year. For exposure and vulnerability, we will notably consider the level of maturity of countries and towns where our sites are located regarding to their commitment to adaptation. That's key. Again, we cannot only adapt our sites, we must take into account the willingness to adapt of the towns, of the region, of the states, if we are in US, of the country itself. Involvement in the local community is a must in this rocky road of adaptation. You may probably, you are probably aware, of course, of what happened recently in US for sure, but today, have a look to what is happening in Spain today. So the recent event with Ilan hurricane, for instance, in North Carolina, for us, is clearly, I would say, showing that the resilience is a matter of all of us. So it's very important to be all together working on that topics. Our study aimed to assess the vulnerability to these events while developing quantitative methodology and tool to perform such vulnerability assessment. And I would say maybe that's quite new for us, for sure, but also for a lot of people which are working on that topic. So we are trying to develop that, and we are in the good track for a time being. And the goal of this analysis will be to identify, we are starting, and implement the required adaptation measure, wherever the company deems it necessary, where we can do that, and based on a progressive learning by doing approach, having in mind that the way we would like to implement this solution we have to be based first on nature and secondly, energetically passive. It's what we are doing today. Of course, we can develop more if necessary. That's it for me.
Thank you, Francis. And I think I want to just mention as a reaction to that, I think we all really appreciate your focus too on people and on communities and kind of just that awareness, but also the systemic approach that you're taking to look at this risk across all of the company's assets, the sites and locations, and kind of taking that extra step further. So I think we'll dig into that a little bit later. Monica, I'd love to turn to you now. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I want to just preface by saying the work at Turner Construction is really exciting as well, and excited for you to share that with our audience.
Yeah, good morning. It's great to be here and hear from the other speakers. A little bit about my company. Turner Construction is a construction management company. We were founded in 1902, and we currently have more than 45 offices in Canada and in the US. In the US alone, we have 6,000 employees, and at any time, we have about 1,500 projects going on, which means that about 100,000 construction workers and staff show up at our sites every day. We can go to the next slide. We build all sorts of buildings and some infrastructure. We build commercial buildings, we build schools, stadiums, airports, data centers. We build both in the private and public sector. And we build very big buildings and also small buildings, both new and also renovated. Our climate resilience efforts started about 4 years ago when the position that I have, Climate Resilience Program Manager, was created. And so we have been working to provide resources and services for our clients and our own operations to incorporate climate resilience in the buildings that we build for our clients, our own operations, and our people. We are aware that if our people are not resilient, we are not as resilient as we can be. And so some of the services and resources that we have provided are essentially resources to speak with our clients about not just severe weather events, but also the fact that our climate is changing. So we can no longer look at historical climate. We have to look at future climate estimates and future climate data. And also have the ability to provide specific solutions for buildings, right? So if flood is a hazard that may affect a specific building, what feature can a building incorporate, and what's the right amount of resilience and sustainability that a building can incorporate? Within our operations, severe weather can affect us in many ways. Sometimes job sites, think of construction sites that you see when you are out and about, they can be more vulnerable than the actual finished building. And so it's about, taking a look at what climate hazards may affect a job site when we're constructing a building, and how can we lessen the impacts from those events. And so it's about training our workforce on what happens if those severe weather events affect a site. How can we place a trailer, or where can we store material to minimize the effect of those hazards? And they're both, as you know, acute and chronic. So heat has been one of those hazards that we have put attention on from even, before my position was created. Our safety department, environmental and health and safety department, has put efforts for decades on making sure that our construction workers are safe and are healthy. But the problem now is the severe weather events are just becoming more and more intense. So it's how do we enhance all those different mitigation strategies that we already have in place. Our supply chain is one aspect that we have put a lot of emphasis on. I think COVID accelerated those efforts. We realized more and more how the systemic effects, right, from one disruption, it could be COVID or it could be, a flood very far away from our site where we're getting some material. So our procurement department has put a lot of emphasis on the resilience of our supply chain and how that can affect our sites. I'm here specifically to tell you about two climate resilience efforts. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll tell you about the heat studies that we are implementing. So this all started last year. We did a heat pilot study of 33 workers, so tiny study, but it really showed, one, the viability of doing these heat studies at job sites. And what we're doing with these heat studies, we're trying to better understand how heat affects the health of our construction workers. So last year, 33 workers were followed for a day by researchers by the University of New Mexico and the University of Indiana to understand how heat affects core temperature of the workers and their heart rate. Because there's a relationship between core temperature, heart rate, and also, effects from heat to the workers, from heat stress to heat stroke to long-term effects like the chronic kidney disease. This year, we began a bigger study. This time, 200 workers participated. This study was funded by the Turner Foundation, Flatiron, our sister company, Chubb, Liberty Mutual Insurance, and McGriff Construction, which I think, shows the emphasis that it's not just one company being interested in doing that. It's really the collaboration of many that are aware of the effects of extreme weather events. So in the heat study that we conducted this summer, the preliminary results are coming out anytime now, and final results Q1 of 2025 consisted of 200 workers who participated for a day each. As you can see in the pictures, they were wearing all sorts of devices, from heart rate monitors to smart watches that kept track of their heart rate, to a pill that half of those workers, so 100, swallowed. It stayed in their body for about 24 to 48 hours, and that kept track of core temperature and heart rate every 10 seconds. So imagine how robust the data is that the researchers are looking at. Also, devices that they hang on their clothes to understand the temperature around where they were working, and also thermometers around, not just thermometers, but also wet bulb monitors, wet bulb temperature monitor, that it's a combination of temperature, humidity, wind, sun exposure. Those monitors were around the site. So to understand, when it's this hot, when it's this humid, how is the body of the workers responding, understanding all the variabilities, that we all have based on who we are and how our body works, but there are correlations, and all of this to enhance our heat mitigation strategies to both protect the health and the wellness of workers in the face of extreme heat. We are noticing, as I'm sure everybody's noticing, how hot summers are getting and how springs and fall. In the United States, Halloween is tomorrow. I was checking out the weather. It's going to be like 70 degrees, and I am in the northeast of the United States. It's just not, this is not normal. So we have to implement heat mitigation strategies and enhanced the ones that are already existing to ensure that our workers can stay healthy in the long term. So again, the final result for this study will come out Q1 2025. And we can go to the next slide. Something else that we are implementing is making climate estimates, future climate estimates, available for our pre-construction teams and our clients. So we get clients in different phases. Some clients are already thinking about this. They have already incorporated climate resilience in their design, all the way to we are that last step before we build a building, and that climate resilience conversation hasn't started yet. So we are, we must have this conversation with our clients. And so this specific data was incorporated in our internal site where we keep all climate things. And so this is just one module that incorporates both future climate data projected through 2050 and then data for construction phase. So that one is just historical understanding that, our sites will last for 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And so we sit down with our clients and have the conversation about, here are the climate hazards that are going to affect your building location through 2050. And we, understanding their goals, the type of building, there's a lot of variabilities, right? The resilience of a data center is not necessarily the same as the climate resilience of a hospital or, a stadium or a school. So it's really about understanding the client's goals and the future climate estimate of the site, and making sure that climate resilience is incorporated in the building to meet the client's goals. It is really, we see incorporating climate resilience in both our operations and the buildings that we build as risk management. It's about, doing what's right. We would never, companies don't sell or don't aim to sell a product that is not going to last. Buildings that we're building today can last up to 100 years or more. So we have to look at the future to make sure that these buildings last for as long as possible, and not just the building, but most importantly their occupants and the communities that surround them. So in a nutshell, those are two of the efforts that we're incorporating within our climate resilience program. And at this point, I'll pass it on back to Amy.
Thanks, Monica. So great to see how you're integrating that across the projects, and then also taking a really detailed look at the workforce impacts. I think, that's something that we'll all be paying attention to as the new results come out from the expanded study. So thank you for sharing that with us today. I want to pull everyone back on the screen for just kind of a group conversation here. And while folks are coming online, maybe I want to start with you, Amy. Actually, you shared such great detail about kind of what's happening across the board, across the corporate sector. But maybe you could say a little bit more about just the insurance industry specifically, in terms of kind of, what is the role that we should be anticipating from the insurance industry in reducing risk to climate impacts?
And for the insurance industry, getting this right is an existential issue. The insurance industry wants to insure. It wants to insure assets, it wants to insure homes, it wants to insure people. And so it is totally invested in making sure that they're resilient, and that's possible. And what we have as the insurance industry is some of the tools to help people quantify the economic return on resilience measures. And the reason that's really important to be able to dollarize that is to be able to decide which resilience measures provide the best returns. And that doesn't just mean for assets, it also means for people. So we need to know whether a nature-based solution will give a better return than an engineered solution, or a recovery effort makes more economic sense than trying to resist the threat of the peril. And so the insurance industry has a huge amount of experience, data, and insight to be able to quantify those risks to help decisions get made. And its incentive is making sure that it can be there to insure in the future. So very invested. Now there is a challenge. And the challenge is partly my background noise, for which I apologize. But there is a challenge in that many insurance contracts are annual cycles. And one of the issues is that we're talking about long-term risks. I think all of the case studies were excellent, and people planning for the future. And who your insurer is today may well not be your insurer of tomorrow. And so are they incentivized to incentivize you to act when that you may not be their client in the future? And that's a dilemma that we need to resolve to make sure that everybody's making good long-term decisions.
Yeah, thank you for putting just that finer point on the actual practical dynamics that folks are facing right now, especially as it comes to thinking about their own coverage and risk transfer. and I find that it seems like the insurance industry is really starting to pay, more attention to these types of risks and be a little bit more involved in what the solutions could be. And so we're hoping to see, more of that in the coming years. And I think the demand is there. So I want to maybe kind of get a little bit more into the strategy of some of the innovations that we've been talking about. And so thinking about, taking something from an initial pilot and looking into the longer term of like, how do you integrate some of these new processes or the new solutions into the kind of the bones of the company, or kind of the typical process of the company, so that it does become mainstreamed in the way that the organization works. And so Francis, I know you've been doing a lot of thinking about that, and Monica as well, Tawi. Just curious if you might all share a few comments on that.
Yeah, I may start. So in fact, since 23, it's mandatory within the group. So we are starting to implement that, and I would say that's starting well. It's mandatory to realize an exposure assessment when we have a project of merger and acquisition of sites, one site of different sites. The same story when we are sourcing new sites for some of our key raw materials, and the same when it comes to new industrial logistic projects. So that's implemented, that's integrated within the project approach, internal project approach, for instance. And yeah, that's mandatory. Of course, we have to progress in order to systematically do that really on the field. I would say for 2 of the 3 dimensions I've mentioned, it's done. We have to progress because we are starting again, let's say from the scratch, to do that for the future. And it's very difficult, notably when it comes to buildings, because in fact, we have to take into account the future climate. And as you may know, in the building codes in the different countries, it's not the case. We must rely on the past climate conditions, and that's crazy. So we have to obtain the future climate, obtain the data for that. We have for the vast majority of our sites. Now the idea is how our engineers and engineering offices will take that into account to I would say, define the new buildings. I'm talking about materials. I'm talking about the way to refresh the internal part of the buildings, their frame, their shape, their position, etc., etc. That's a new rule. In fact, that's new competencies to acquire. But we are on the way to do that.
In our case, and I'll focus on the heat study and how we manage heat at the sites. Historically, we know that hydration, shade, and breaks is really the way that you mitigate heat at sites. What we hope to enhance, and we already have even with the heat pilot study, is what other specific strategies. So in the heat pilot study from last year, we one of the results was that 48% of the workers were dehydrated when they showed up at the site. So we have accelerated that effort on encouraging workers to hydrate while not at work. When they go home at night, when they wake up in the morning, it's about drinking water and or electrolytes along with our coffee in the morning. So it may sound very easy to do, but it's really about education and awareness. Think of when you're rushing to work. Even us, like we just grab the coffee and go. So, and construction, working in construction is very physical. Sometimes think of a roofer at a hot location, working with hot materials over, hot surfaces. It all just, it's hotter than even just the temperature. So you have to deal with just not the temperature, the humidity, but also the activity that you're working. I mean, some of them are like athletes, doing races. So we emphasize hydration, even their graphics at sites that show the color of your urine and what it should look like when you're hydrated and what it looks like when you're not hydrated. So that is the hope to, enhance all those heat mitigation strategies based on results from the heat studies.
And from AES's end, I would say like resilience, like that is embedded in our strategy, just not only from the technology side, we also think about it from the community side because that's what all our stakeholders would expect from our company. And when I talk about stakeholders, everything from like investors to customers to your government, public sector stakeholders, communities, you name it. If we're just thinking about the El Salvador example, what really like helped push that project forward was it was the government. They saw a need in their country to really accelerate the energy transition so that no community is left unenergized. And we actually, Manguera is just one example of the broader rural electrification work that we've been doing in the country. We actually started back in 2001 with the government of El Salvador. And since then, we've been able to um, power over 84,000 rural families' homes or households. And really, the driver was government sharing the costs with us. And then we focused more of our attention on the labor, the implementation, really bringing in that global expertise to really tailor the solutions so that it meets the needs of those respective rural communities. And if we just zoom out of like the El Salvador context, this is just fully aligned with our social impact strategy, which really focuses on access to like affordable, reliable, and safe energy, and also basic services. We also have around inclusive economic growth, the environment, and also community resilience is another area that we focus on with our social impact strategy. And that guides a lot of the work we do from both the technology side, like deploying that solution, and also on the community side. And I know that there was a question around KPIs, and we have KPIs that we definitely track to make sure that we're achieving the shared goals that we set out with our customers, government, other stakeholders, community leaders, just being accountable for what we're putting into the communities and the benefits, and or I should say like outcomes that we're trying to drive.
Well, thank you for bringing in the KPIs question, Tawi. I think I'd love to pose it to the other three of you. We talk in the resilience world a lot about metrics and what are the indicators of resilience, and there's just so many, especially when you compare it to decarbonization, which is, far simpler in many ways. So I'm curious, just in your own kind of spheres, what are some of the kind of typical indicators that you might be looking for in terms of driving climate resilience in your own sector, or that you maybe just want to kind of flag for the audience today?
And I can just say very quickly on our end, like resilience, there's the operational side of things where we talk a lot about grid resilience, making sure that that asset is running 24/7. Customers, including residential, commercial customers, you name it, their lights are on 24/7. And then on the social impact side, it really depends. With El Salvador, the KPI that they were more focused on was like number of rural families or households that were without power or now with power. And so that was one KPI that we were tracking. But then there are around like additional KPIs around like economic growth that we're also tracking. And that's not a KPI that we're tracking alone. It's something that AES, along with our partners, we're trying to see like how this project is positively impacting the communities. And so with our local teams and also our stakeholders, we're tracking that and also sharing some of those lessons learned. And that's actually helping other conversations to really embed climate resilience on like the regulatory side, like using this example as a test bed, as a foundation for other regulatory changes to really accelerate the deployment of climate resilient solutions in the country.
When it comes to KPIs, and Amy, Billy, you're right, it's not as easy to quantify resilience as it is to quantify carbon. But there are ways to quantify it. So in our job sites, we are able to quantify how many resilience strategies are implemented at our job sites. We developed a tool called Job Site Resilience Assessment. And so it's about analyzing what climate hazards will affect the site, what resilience strategies can be implemented to deal with the medium risk or high risk severe weather events. And so it's about how many job site resilience assessments are performed. And also on the, how much effects those severe weather events have on sites. It's about quantifying how many weather related incidents are at sites, how many weather related claims, schedule delays also related to extreme weather events. And when it comes to the actual building that we are building, we are quantifying how many conversations we have with our clients on climate resilience and how many actions based on those conversations take place so that, more resilience is incorporated in the buildings that we built.
So I think that Monica has already said that we don't have one unit of measure, but there are measures by each dimension, and we have to have those, not just as KPIs, but in order to prioritize how we act, because we can't do everything everywhere all at once. And so we do need to have quantification so that we can prioritize our actions. And then the KPIs, I think Francis talked a lot about the physical risk assessment that they're doing for their extensive asset portfolio. And so at that asset level, you can have KPIs about performance, about downtime. And so I think the businesses that we're working with and supporting, we're helping them identify where are their key vulnerabilities, and let's build the KPI suite that is most reflects the vulnerabilities at those sites. And I would say, of course, that insurance is part of the resilience strategy. We need businesses to be physically resilient, but insurance gives financial resilience. And so actually the availability and the cover that you've got for the exposures you've got is one of the KPIs that's embedded in that.
Yes, I'll resonate to that. Obviously, I think resilience is a combination of many things, right? So you transfer some risk, other risk you avoid, other risk you mitigate. It really just takes the analysis, right, of what is the amount of climate resilience you're comfortable with having, or amount of risk rather.
Yeah, I fully agree. Because we are starting, in fact, we have not developed any KPIs dedicated to resilience and dedicated specifically to climate change. But that's something we will have to do, I would say, prudently, because maybe the weakest point is not the assets, or that's people. Because in fact, the way to resist to an event, whatever the events, are we, it's us. So how to measure that? How to measure first, maybe what the people are feeling today when it comes to climate change. We are starting to do that. We have every year a survey which is aiming to, I would say, understand how the people are feeling in their work. That's a worldwide survey. And definitely that's a tool that we are using to capture really interesting information when it comes to the change of the climate in our notably industry, but not only. So that's more than weak signals. And that will be used in order to measure the progress. Certainly, when it comes to people, that will be one aspect. Of course, we have KPIs when it comes to the implementation of our policy, for sure, no problem. And we will develop in the frame of the CSRD, the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, the European one, but which has a worldwide impact for us, the necessary KPI when it comes to the ESRS 1, E1, dedicated to adaptation. No problem, financial one and non-financial one. We will do that, but we probably will have to go further, notably when it comes to the resilience of the community. And just to highlight something that will be submitted to, I would say, discussion internally, when it comes to the adaptation of the sites, we will consider, we have built an indicator relating to the resilience of the community, of the local community where the sites are located. Local community, that means towns, regions, states, and country, in order to understand where we are today. Of course, in the future, maybe that will be different. But that's something that will be important for us to understand what could be an adaptation measure. You know, adaptation measure is I stay and I'm less fragile, resilient or less fragile, let's say, or I leave. I suppress the exposure. So that's something that will be used to, I would say, highlight a decision, to make some, I would say, more information, to give more information about decisions that could be taken about investment, for instance, when it comes to adaptation. So we are going to develop, we have already developed that, for instance, but when it comes to resilience, that's systemic. So it's not only one or two KPI. That's much more complex, I think. But again, let me few months, few years to develop that in order to follow the progress on resilience. And something which is very difficult, and I finish with that. It's not a question of measuring the number of molecules of carbon dioxide you are going to reduce. When you're applying a solution, nature-based or energetically passive solution, you don't know exactly what will be the benefit. You don't know. You have to test or simulate. It's not so easy, I would say. So let's test and we will see the impact measured by physical data. And after that, I would say, expressed by people who are, I hope, who will benefit from this adaptation measure.
I think that's such a great point, and this is very much early days in figuring out kind of which types of measures might be the most valuable or how these measures might be interacting with one another. And I think it's important to give ourselves some space to test these things out and, you know, not lock into one measure that is the requirement for everyone, or, you know, just allow folks to kind of see what is going to help improve their overall resilience in their own spheres. And so we'll check back with you, Francis, in a couple of years when you've got your first set of metrics all figured out. I want to ask a question from the audience, and then I have one last question about COP, just to kind of preface that for you all. You know, there's a recognition that there's a lot of different guidances out there. There's, you know, different regulatory changes kind of coming down the pike with, you know, the UK regulatory landscape. You've got California, you've got SEC things, you know, there's lots of different kinds of different drivers in the environment, in the, you know, the corporate space right now. And I'm curious if you could comment on, you know, how should a company manage all of those, you know, different kind of pressures and drivers, and how is that impacting, you know, your work, and if I could add one more step to that, what else is needed to help, you know, move the space forward, so that there is a little bit more kind of action and clarity for companies? Big questions.
I feel like you're waiting for a shameless plug for C2ES's work. Because a framework.
Not necessarily. We would love to hear. We want to hear all of it. Put it all on the table.
I don't have the responsibility for reporting, although from my perspective, there is far less reporting requirements and prescriptive reporting about resilience. Most of the reporting is around mitigation. That doesn't mean there's none, but much of it can be qualitative because we don't have those quantitative measures. And that is something that C2S is working on, a framework for reporting on resilience. And one of my big asks of C2ES in that really important work is creating a framework that has interoperability. So the private sector can communicate effectively with the public sector, with communities, so everybody is using a consistent and coherent measure, so that we have a way to not just make reporting a friction that we have to do, but have the reporting actually to be value creating because of the interoperable nature of it.
I have a small piece on the reporting my company does, but something I have observed in the last few years is that our ESG team was created and is growing. So I think it's just having folks dedicated to reporting, dedicated to figuring out how we comply with all of those directives, and how that feeds into our own ESG strategies and efforts. So I think people knowledgeable about all of this and full-time dedicated and willing and able to collaborate with different groups in the company, right? So as the climate resilience person in my company, I collaborate with risk management, environmental health and safety, sustainability, which is the team that I sit under. And, I sit on the ERM and the enterprise risk management team. And so it's about I think it's about having people dedicated to all of these efforts. Will just continue, advancing not just our resilience, but also being able to comply to all these different directives and regulations.
And on
Absolutely.
AES, oh, Francis, go ahead.
No, sorry. Let's go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to build off of your comment, Francis, too, because you mentioned CSRD. Like a lot of global companies, we are experiencing a lot of different requirements and are all trying to wrap our heads around it. But for us, we completed our materiality assessment last year. And so as a part of that process, we actually created a framework to really guide our work as we think about all the changes that are coming from all the different stakeholders that we work with, and at the same time find ways to integrate resilient solutions and clear KPIs. And I'll echo what all the other panelists have mentioned, and it's really like, what are those set of metrics and KPIs that we can work towards? I'm representing the energy industry here, Francis, like representing like manufacturing, and then we have insurance, we have construction. Like there are common KPIs that we can all be working towards. And I think a big piece of it is like on the nature side, there's also the people side. The people side, I think, is where a lot of the work needs to really focus on as well. Like, I don't think that's as clear cut as the nature side. And I'm just speaking from an energy perspective.
Fully agree with all those comments. And maybe just adding that we are a big company, so we have ways and means to do the things. We have people we can hire. But let's think about the other one, smallest company who maybe don't have which maybe don't have the time to work on that when it comes to adaptation. Talking about that, sometimes the word itself is not known. There is a recent study last year in France in thousands of small company, and in fact they don't know what it is exactly, or not at all. But we need them. We need them to adapt. It's the same story as for the town, region, etc., etc. So I would say, in order to help this ecosystem to start on the road of adaptation, let's share simple, understandable guide with a frame for sure, describing the route to adaptation. Information to make them aware about the ongoing climate change, because a lot of people are not aware about that for sure, or are not, I would say, understanding or don't want to understand what is happening, with information that relates to their own daily experience, life experience, not big concept that what is exactly happening to me. And affordable, user-friendly tools and data in order for them to easily assess their own exposure and quantify their vulnerability, because it's only by quantification that you can be aware that you have to do or try to do something. That's in fact the experience we have today based on our own path since 1.5 years on the road to adaptation. So that what we lived as a big company, what we're still living as a big company, of course, smallest one will live the same, I would say, issue and hurdles, and they will face the same hurdles in order to progress on that topic, because they will have to progress on that topic. And I would say also, as much as possible, try to convince and sometimes to beneficiate from the experience of countries, states, towns where we are located. Because again, what we are seeing, of course, in US, but not only, of course, because fortunately the climate change is expressing everywhere, every day. If there is not this commitment of everybody locally, that will be a big mess. That will be a big mess. So it's very important to discuss, to exchange, to share where we are not strong, our doubt, but to work together, and not by words, doing that concretely.
Yeah, and thank you. That's such a great point, I think, for us to end on. I know we are at time. That that collaborative aspect here is just, it's required, from mitigating the risk, outside of your own operations, just to understanding kind of what the best solutions are, what the real challenges are. And so this will continue to push us to work outside of our comfort zones and with new partners. And I just want to thank all of our speakers for your wonderful insights today and for taking the time to share those with us. Um, we're at time, so I just want to make one last point. We timed this right ahead of COP because we know that there's going to be a lot of conversations about, financing adaptation and really pushing this forward. And so one message that we want to kind of make sure that we are elevating is that the private sector is really starting to figure out how to address this challenge. And there's a number of ways, as we've heard today, of how this is taking shape. But we do need to go faster, and we need to really make sure that we're doing this well. And so that's one reason why we at C2ES think sharing these stories of how companies are getting started, how they're really starting to put some investments into place is really important. So I want to remind folks that we will post the recording of today's conversation on the C2ES YouTube page, so you can find it there forever. We'll also make sure we send this out to registrants after the fact, and I'll close with a simple call to action to join us in this effort. We really want to elevate corporate climate resilience action and galvanize the private sector on this issue. Please look out for additional events in the future that we'll be hosting, and tomorrow we'll be pushing out a report that kind of collects some of the case studies you heard about today and a number of others, as well as our innovation stories library, where a lot of this will live online as well. And if you are a corporation and inspired to share your own story of innovation on climate resilience with us, please let us know. Take a look at our website, and let's get engaged there. So I'll end there, and thank you all for your time and for joining us today, and have a great day.